do the start sharing again because it looks like, there it is. It looks great. This is a Healthy Habitat conducting lawful background checks in Texas. So Natalie is a board member for Comal County Habitat and has helped Habitat Texas on many legal issues, and really appreciate her donating her time to us today. Natalie.
Great. Thank you. I've never done this before where I can't see you guys, so that means I can't see if anybody has a question or if somebody has a perplexed look on their face. So if that happens, if you do have a question, I believe, Amy, what we've decided is we're going to try, if folks just want to, if you've got your phone muted, if you want to go ahead and unmute and interrupt, I normally speak very quickly. I'll try to speak slowly and pause, and I'll try to ask if anybody has questions periodically, and we'll see how that goes. Otherwise, if you want to wait until the end and reserve your questions, I'll leave some time for that as well.
I will also let me add real quick, Natalie, I'm sorry to interrupt, that the phone is very sensitive, so if you're typing or moving around your office, we can hear that. So if you'll just mute your line as if you can, or you can also use the chat feature to send me a question, and I'll be glad to read it aloud to Natalie. So to mute your line, you need to hit *6 or *5. And the same way to unmute it, *5.
Use your line or something? I don't know how to mute. Let me try it. Here's mute over here.
*5 is how you mute. So it sounds like everybody's muted. Thank you very much, Natalie. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Sure, you bet. Again, my name is Natalie Rougeaux. Don't worry about how to say the last name. Just call me Natalie. I am board certified in labor and employment law here in Texas. So my focus is primarily from an employment background. That being said, because of my involvement with Habitat and other nonprofits, I've also looked at other issues that relate not necessarily only to the employment context. I want to provide you information on both, and obviously we want to focus a little bit on Texas, but let's kind of get started and tell you a little bit about what we're going to cover or why we're covering this. I mean, as you know, the Habitat International requires that all affiliates conduct sex offender registry checks on anybody who's going to be a potential homeowner, any family members that are going to reside in the home, any of your board members, your staff members, or employees is a better way to say that, and your key volunteers. And key volunteers are generally those that work 8 or more hours per week or per period, however you define your period, whether that's a project, et cetera, or those who are routinely coming in contact with a vulnerable population. And a vulnerable population is going to be somebody who is elderly, somebody who is young, like a child, anybody who has any special circumstances. So you want to be on the conservative side on that, but you're required to do that. You're also required to develop, adopt, and implement a written sex offender registry check policy. So we're going to talk a little bit about sex offender registry checks separate and apart from general background checks. And then we're going to talk about background checks, primarily criminal background checks, although I'm going to touch on some that are not fully criminal. They can be various aspects are related to criminal. Now, that is not required of the affiliates, but International strongly recommends that you do so, and I strongly recommend that you do so. We're going to talk about the federal and state requirements for doing these types of checks. And for the most part, I will tell you that Texas does not have a lot of requirements. It has more common law issues, and so I'm going to talk to you about what those are. I'm going to give you some of the statutory requirements, but it's mostly going to be what we call common law, or law that is developed through case law. And I think I just heard somebody join, so if anybody joins in, I'll just kind of keep on going, and Amy, if anybody has any issues, I'll let you address that, okay?
Okay.
Okay, so, okay, great. And then finally, one of the main reasons that we're looking at this, or that I assume that you're wanting to be to attend this is because there's a growing emphasis right now on these types of checks. There's a growing examination of particularly employers of how they're doing these checks because there's trouble with rehabilitation. Folks who have a criminal background or something in their background that's unpleasant, they have a hard time getting employment or participating in society or achieving the benefits of society, such as ownership of a home or volunteering, all those good things. And when they can't do that, there's a higher instance of them of recidivism or repeating their crimes. And so there's a great emphasis on that. However, you have to balance that societal desire issue with your need to protect the folks that work with you, the folks that you serve as habitat. And so what we're going to talk about today is how we're trying to balance all that. So that's what we're going to cover. Let's kind of just jump right into that. All right, so let's talk about sex offender registry checks first. Texas law, again, does not really govern, whether you can or you cannot do these types of checks, but it does govern who can be around certain types of the population, and sex offenders is one of those. So in Texas, a sex offender cannot be within 500 feet of any place where children are known to congregate. Where children are known to congregate, it's going to depend, but the obvious ones are going to be youth centers, schools, playgrounds, arcades, swimming pools. For you guys, it could even be, depending on what type of programs you have, what type of builds you do, you could have youth builds, for example, high school builds, et cetera. So that's going to be an area where a sex offender could not congregate under the law. And so because of that, we want to make sure on our end that we're trying to prevent that from occurring. And that means also if you are working somewhere that is near the school, putting a home in that is near the school, keep in mind they can't be within 500 feet of that. Now, again, as I said, Texas does not prohibit you from checking this. You can go online. We're going to talk about the resources to do that. And there's really very little limitation on doing so from a statutory standpoint. However, there is common law concerns, and those are privacy concerns. So you have the privacy of the individual that you're checking, right? And then you have to balance that with negligence, meaning if you fail to check this person out and somebody is injured by a sex offender or a child is injured by a sex offender, habitat can be subject to liability for negligence. And so in Texas, those have been recognized, and we've seen certainly cases where, for example, there's a case that was reported years ago against Boys and Girls Club where somebody was injured by a sex offender, and because, although not statutorily required to conduct the check, because they did not do the check, that was deemed to be negligent because obviously working with kids, a reasonable person would have and should have checked that. So that's why you want to do it. But again, you want to protect the privacy of the individuals you're checking because you're doing it as an organization. This isn't, if you put it in a personal context, if you move into a new neighborhood, you want to pull up the sex registry because you have kiddos and you want to see, hey, does anybody in this neighborhood have a conviction or have they been required to register? Obviously, you don't need to go over to your neighbor and have them sign a consent for you to do that. Here, however, because you're an organization and you're doing it as an organization, you do want to get that notice out to let somebody know you're doing it, and you want to get their consent. I will tell you, especially with volunteers, the biggest issue is always, what are you doing with this information? Who is going to see this information if you're going to run a check on me, whether it's sex registry or it's general criminal background? And so having that notice, having that consent, we're going to talk about policies in a little bit, having all that together not only enables you to make sure that you're protected and show that you've done what you need to do to make sure that the individuals that you work with are protected, but also to reassure the individual, particularly, again, volunteers or board members, for example, that this information isn't just being willy-nilly shared with the entire organization or folks that shouldn't see it. If you use a third party, that you actually hire somebody to run your background checks, which I highly recommend if you can afford to do so, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But if you do that, the FCRA or the Fair Credit Reporting Act will apply in the same manner as it applies to criminal background checks. And we're going to talk about that separately, and I'll try to remember to refer back to, for you guys to remember that it does apply to these sex offender registries, but I separated it out because I know that some affiliates, or my understanding is some affiliates, they do only the sex registry check because that's what's required by international, but they don't necessarily do the criminal. So I'm going to keep that separate. As far as where you can go, HUD and Habitat International, they highly recommend, as do I, that you go to the Department of Justice National Sex Offender Public Registry. On the slides, that there's a website there for you. It's also been provided to the affiliates by Habitat International. For those who may not have the slides, it's www.nsopr.gov, and you can look just at a particular state, or you can look on a national level. I recommend you do the broadest search that you can. In a pinch, you can also go to the Texas Department of Safety. That is information that's submitted by the Criminal Justice Department as well as some other departments and agencies such as Youth Commission or other local law enforcement agencies. Caveats to that, obviously, particularly for the Texas one, it's not always going to be complete. It is reliant upon people getting this information in. So that's why, again, we do recommend the Department of Justice one because it's going to be better. It's going to be more comprehensive. Again, you can access in Texas the Texas Department of Safety website, and you can look at those records, and you can use them for any lawful purpose. But again, it is your responsibility to make sure that you're accessing the information appropriately, that you're not violating those common law rights that I talked about, privacy, particularly of the individual, which is why we recommend, again, the notice and consent. But also what's really important is that you verify that the individual is who you think it is. In other words, if you go on these registries, it's generally just by name. You have limited information that you can put into the registry, and there are misidentifications that occur. So you certainly don't want to take an adverse action, such as denying somebody employment, denying them the ability to be a partner family, denying them the ability to volunteer, et cetera, unless you have taken some steps to ensure that this is the individual that is listed on the registry. And when we talk about the actual policies or how we conduct background checks, I'm going to, again, try to remember to refer back to this point as well, because it all applies. And part of that process you will see is going back to the individual and saying, hey, this is what we found out. Is this true? And can you give us some more information about it? So that is just a quick overview of sex offender registry. Again, what we've talked about already is going to apply to some of the other background check laws that we continue to talk about. But before I move on, does anybody have any questions just about that part? Okay.
Natalie,
Yep.
just for kind of a point of technicality, the gray box, the sharing box is covering a little part of your presentation. So you might grab that by the corner. It hasn't been too bad. You can slide it all the way over.
There. If I need it, I can find it. I'm sorry about that. Thank you for pointing that out. I thought only I could see that.
No. It was fine. We just saw a gray box, so that's all. Thank you. I'm sorry. Keep going.
Well, that can be annoying. Okay. Okay, good. And for anybody, am I talking too fast? Because I tend to do that because I usually charge by the hour. So.
And remember *5 to mute or unmute.
Hi, this is Leah. Am I unmuted?
Okay. Yep.
Yes.
I did have a quick question. When I got our background checks from our Kiwanis school, they gave us little cards, so we all show that we have clearance. Do we need to, and you may be covering that in a little bit, but if we all have to have cards saying we've had our background check cleared?
You do not have to give somebody a card that says that it's a good question. No, that's not something I would have covered. By the way, real quick before I finish answering that, my screen went down and I popped it back up. Can you still see it, Amy, everybody?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Other background check.
Okay, perfect. But no, you don't have to provide them a card that says that they passed, quote unquote. But as long as you have appropriate documentation as an organization to show that you did in fact run the check and that they did pass. And I've never recommended giving a card, and my immediate reaction to that, quite honestly, is I wouldn't like to give that kind of card to somebody because I would be a little bit hesitant or concerned about what they might do with that card in terms of using it for other purposes, such as persuading a future volunteer organization, employer, whatever it is, hey, you don't need to run the background check because Habitat says I'm good. And I wouldn't want that to potentially come back on you. So I would actually not recommend getting the card, if that makes sense.
Okay, no, that makes perfect sense. Thanks.
Okay, good question. Okay, so let's move on to other background checks. In general, again, I've already talked about the Texas common law on negligence, meaning you can be negligent if you fail to conduct a background check and a jury or a judge later feels that you should have, while at the same time you, again, have to protect the privacy interests of the individual you're checking. So we talked about sex registry for criminal background. An example would be if somebody comes into the workplace or is a volunteer and goes out onto a build site and seriously harms somebody else, and we come to find out that had we done a background check, we'd have seen that they've been in prison 6 times for aggravated assault, it could very well be determined that we were negligent because had we done a check, then somebody would not have been injured while affiliated with Habitat. So that's, again, how the negligence part of that applies. Now, for employment checks, there is a Texas law that states that unless the position is paying $75,000 or more, that the information is limited to 7 years. The federal law actually also limits to 7 years, but Texas does not. Now, there's a technicality in the law that says that is a provider, such as a third-party provider, cannot provide that information to you. It doesn't necessarily or explicitly state that the employer, if provided that information, cannot take it into consideration or use it, but I would advise you not to. I would tell, or at least to do so carefully. Most of my employers, I will tell you, their background check companies give them information that goes all the way back, forever and ever. And, I don't have any problem necessarily with my employer seeing that, but you want to have this law in mind, particularly because there is such an emphasis on how you use information obtained in a background check and how you make your decisions, which we're going to talk about. But if somebody committed murder 8 years ago, you may want to very well know about that. I wouldn't go out and try to get it. I wouldn't ask for it. But if you do use a third party that provides it to you and you had not requested it, then you may or may not take it into consideration. Just know that if you take it into consideration, this statute could be used to argue that really the intent was that folks are not penalized for something that is older than 7 years. Now, again, if you are going to use a third party, the Federal Credit Reporting Act, which we're going to talk about, applies. That applies to if you're doing employment and employment contacts. It also applies for your partner family background checks. And I do recommend that you use a third party, but if you're not using a third party, the FCRA notices do not apply. I'm going to talk about the notices, and I'm going to tell you, probably repeat myself, that even if they don't apply, meaning you're not using a third party, I still highly recommend that you basically follow the FCRA steps, because I think it provides a tremendous amount of protection in other areas, and those areas are primarily the next bullet point, which is the anti-discrimination rules. You've got the EOC, which is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the OFCCP, that's the Office for Federal Contract Compliance and Programs, so that's if you're receiving federal grant money of a certain amount, and then of course you have the Fair Housing Act. All of those essentially boil down to this. We can, as you know, you cannot intentionally discriminate against somebody because of their race, gender, national origin, etc. Meaning, I'm not hiring you because you are Hispanic. I'm not going to allow you to partner with us as a family because you are Hispanic. Obviously, that is prohibited. What's also prohibited, however, is what's called disparate impact discrimination, and that means I didn't intend to discriminate against you. That was not my intention at all. However, I have a policy that nonetheless has the effect of doing so, and the agencies are really focusing on background checks in this area because, statistically speaking, minorities are arrested and convicted at a much higher rate than non-minorities. And so if you have a policy that says any criminal background, or 2 instances, 3, and some arbitrary policy that you apply across the board that is most likely going to have a negative impact on minorities, and that will be deemed discriminatory. So we're going to cover how you deal with that. The Office of Foreign Assets Control prohibits transactions with specially designated nationals. Those are folks that are essentially supporting terrorism or engaged in narcotics trafficking. We're going to talk about that a little bit, very briefly. The SAFE Act, we're going to talk about that as well. And that's new, and I believe the International will give you guys some information on that as well, on background checks and loan origination employees. So we're going to talk about that. With all of this, when I talk about background checks, we want to be looking at convictions only. We don't want to be looking at arrests because, generally speaking, an arrest is, it's supposed to be, at least in our society, that you're innocent until proven guilty. And so these agencies that control this, and when they set out these rules, they really are wanting you to look at arrests. At convictions, not arrests. Then I'm going to briefly touch on, other than when required by law or required to obtain financing or required to qualify for a home or to partner with a family, I really do not advise that you do a credit check, meaning not criminal, not sex registry, but just general credit check. So let's kind of start running through those. Related to all this, of course, is, now I've given you some websites. Well, what about Googling? Again, if we're going to use a third party, you have to follow the FCRA. If you want to, in general, just Google something, use the registry or for the Department of Justice, and, I'm just going to Google.
You are now muted.
I'm going to say it's just because it's related. I won't spend much time on it, but it's not prohibited. If you do it appropriately, there's no invasion of privacy, meaning you can't go and check somebody out on the internet through false means, like getting somebody to give you their friend's password to Facebook, or pretending to friend somebody on Facebook, or linking with them when you're not on LinkedIn, when you have really no intention of connecting with them on a professional level. All those can be devious means, so to speak. Devious is a strong word, but essentially that's the way they're looked at, and that can be a violation of privacy. The OC does think that it's a minefield because you can find things that you really wish you didn't know, like this person is very active in the whatever church they belong to. Their sexual preferences are revealed, their race, their gender, the fact that they are, how many children or pregnancies they've had, all those good things. So especially from an employment law perspective, you really don't want to do that. So if you, in the employment world, if you are going to do that, you only want to do it after you've already offered the job. I would also recommend you have one person who does that and feeds the information obtained to the appropriate decision maker. Meaning, if you're hiring, and again, or you're maybe even a volunteer, you're wanting to bring somebody into the Habitat environment, one individual, you say, great, we want you to come on board, and you just subject to us passing whatever tests we have you pass, or background checks, et cetera. And then one person, if one person wants to generally Google or Bing or whatever somebody, that person then, if they find things that are relevant to the volunteer status, relevant to work status, can then tell the decision maker what they found while protecting the decision maker from the irrelevant factors such as the race or religion, et cetera. So that's just, I wanted to do a brief stop on that, even though it's not technically a background check. All right, so let's talk about the FCRA. Any questions on what I've said so far?
You are now unmuted.
Good. Okay. All right, FCRA. You have to use this again if you are using a third party, and that just means you're paying somebody to run a check, okay, whether it's sex registry or it's general background check. You have to have a separate and standalone authorization, and there's nothing that is separate in Texas. This is the law that applies. You want to be following that federal law. Keep in mind that in January 1, the summary of rights that you also have to provide was revised, and I've given you the website for those. If you still don't have the presentation, it's www.ftc.gov/credit, and you can get that summary. But the International has actually given some forms or has forms. So if you go to habitat.org, you can find some forms here. But essentially, you can't build that authorization, for example, into your application or to some other pre-employment documentation that you're having the individual sign, or with the homeowners or potential homeowners, family partners. You can't just kind of bury this in the general paperwork. It needs to be separate. If disqualifying information is discovered, you then need to provide that individual with a written notice of their potential ineligibility that essentially says, as you know, we've conducted a background check, whether it's criminal, whether it's sex registry, whatever it is that you're doing. Here's a copy of what we found, and here's again your summary of rights if this is an FCRA issue, and you've got 5 days to come in and let us know if you have any rebuttal or any other information that you want to provide. If you don't get a rebuttal, or if you just otherwise determine they're not qualified because the rebuttal didn't satisfy you, then you need to also provide a final notice that says we have deemed you ineligible due to your background information. Again, you can get sample notices from the International. You do not in those notices have to state why you made your decision, how you made your decision, et cetera. It's just we've made a decision, and all you have to say is due to information obtained during your background check. Now, if you're not covered by the FCRA because you're not using a third party, I really recommend that you basically follow these steps. Obviously, the part you're going to exclude is the FCRA summary of rights. But I still recommend you have a separate notice and consent for any type of background check you're doing, that if you think they're going to be ineligible, you provide them notification of that, give them that opportunity to respond, and then notice that you've made the decision. And I think you're going to see why as we move forward. Anybody have any questions on the FCRA? Yes, go ahead.
Okay, say that again about if a third party's doing the checking, we go through a third party and get the information.
Okay, so what do you mean by you go through a third party? Meaning if you're just going to www.doj, if you're just entering into, for example, for sex registry, you're just going to the Texas.
Yeah, we get that basically, right? But we use First Service Credit, and we join them, and then we use we type into their website, and then we get their information. So is that
and are you paying? That's going to be a third party because I'm assuming you're paying a fee for that.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
Yeah. Generally speaking, if you're paying a fee, you are using a third party.
Okay.
So Hire Right or anything that has the word credit in their name.
Okay.
These are third parties, so you need to be compliant, and it is your responsibility to comply with it, not the credit agency that is running this check. Now, they a lot of times will have forms for you to use, though. So, just kind of as part of the benefit or the package. But yes, that's a good question, and that is a third party. The only time it's not a third party is when you yourself go online and use public information, publicly accessible websites, as like DPS, Department of Justice. That's the only time it is not a third party. Any other time, you want to assume that you are using a third party.
Okay, thank you.
You bet. Good question. All right. Okay, so why do I recommend that you follow the FCRA procedures, even if you're not using a third party? And it's because of these anti-discrimination protections. Now, again, there's all these various anti-discrimination laws that are out there. In Texas, we have the Texas Labor Code, which prohibits discrimination on all the same factors that the federal law protects, which is ACE, race, national origin, et cetera, right? Gender, all that good stuff. So we have the Texas Labor Code. We have Title VII, which is the federal law that the EOC regulates or investigates. We have, as I said before, the OFCCP for federal grants and funds and contractors. We have the Fair Housing Act. So all of these prohibit discrimination. The EOC issued guidelines last year on how they feel you should analyze information that is obtained during a background check to avoid these disparate impacts, meaning a sort of unintentional discrimination. And while all these other agencies are sort of jumping on board with various guidelines. They're essentially all saying the same thing that the EOC is saying. So I think if you follow the EOC guidelines, you're in pretty good shape. And the EOC guidelines require that any decision that is based upon a criminal background check be job-related and consistent with business necessity. And then you can, on the non-employment context, you can, instead of saying job-related, right, you would want to say, you could say benefit-related or business-related, or so kind of throw in your word. But in other words, if it is consistent with what we need to do as a business, quote unquote, as an organization, volunteer organization is also a business, so it doesn't exclude habitat, obviously. So if you're making decisions that are based on that, then you're going to be in good shape. But what does that mean? Well, they have found that folks have over-exaggerated the fears of folks that have convictions. And so they've kind of given some more guidelines on that. Obviously, again, as I said at the beginning, convictions only. Now I say except in extenuating circumstances. Extenuating circumstances would be when somebody has an arrest, it shows up on the record, and you're very concerned about it. So let's say, for example, it is related to children or a vulnerable member of the population. Says, you know, we've run your background check, and here it shows that it's an arrest, it's not a conviction, but that you were arrested for child molestation. If the person admits it, then you're good to go, because now it's not based on an arrest. Your decision is not based on the arrest. It's based on the individual saying, yes, I did do this. Even if the individual doesn't admit it, however, if it is something extreme like that, where it is just too risky to have them in the work environment, then I would say, yeah, you might need to make a decision based on an arrest. But an arrest for, you know, yeah, I got arrested for bad checks. I got arrested for robbery, et cetera, and they're not going to be around money and then they're not in a financial situation. Those that's when you're starting to get to that gray line. You might want to seek advice for individual circumstances, because there's just no bright line rule I can give you. But I don't want you to feel like, oh gosh, this person's been arrested for child molestation, but since it's an arrest, Natalie says I can't take this into consideration, and now I'm going to put them in front of our partner families. No, obviously something that extreme. You want to take the protection of the individuals who are working with Habitat or partnering with Habitat in consideration, at least in my opinion, over and above this risk that there could be this unintentional disparate impact, discrimination, et cetera, because that's getting pretty far down the line in terms of risk analysis, whereas putting somebody who is potentially dangerous in the environment, I think, is a much higher risk of resulting in bad things, for lack of a better way to say that. But in general, it's convictions that you want to be relying on. You want to look at the nature and the gravity of the offense or the conduct that's underlying the offense. What was it, in other words? Just because somebody has a criminal background does not necessarily mean that they should be excluded from participation in Habitat programs. It depends on what it was. How much time has passed? Was this something stupid that somebody did when they were in college? Is this something that just happened last week? Has it just happened last week and it's kind of minor, but on the other hand, they seem to have one of these convictions once every year? Now, all that needs to come into play. And then obviously, what is it that they are, why are you conducting the background check? If it's for employment, what's the nature of the job? If this is an accounting type position or a position where the person's going to have access to the Habitat funds and they are in charge of fundraising efforts and tracking the fundraising that comes in, for example, and then they have a financial conviction that's going to be related. Somebody who has a financial conviction, however, and is out working on the construction side, as long as they're not involved with funds, maybe not, it's probably not going to be related. So it really does take an analysis. You can't just say, crime, done. Now, International, I believe, has put out some guidelines. I don't know if only for sex offenders or for both sex offenders and general criminal background information. I believe for both, but those guidelines are kind of help you to rate how level it is. Some of my clients have developed matrices where they have kind of a red, a yellow, and a green. Green is good to go. We've determined that these are the types of activities or programs that you can participate in with X types of crimes. These are the crimes and activities put together that we feel we have to look closer at, and then here's absolute no-nos. And so that can be helpful for folks who need to have some guidelines. You do want to give the person an opportunity to respond. And so, again, you're looking at all the facts and circumstances, but you have to do that in conjunction with talking to somebody. The piece of paper you're going to get, as you know if you've run these checks, is going to basically say the nature of the crime and when it was and the disposition. And by the way, for convictions, I do consider, and in Texas you can, not of all states, but in Texas you can consider deferred adjudication, nolo contendere, no contest pleas. You can consider those as convictions. Again, not in other states, but you can here in Texas. But anyway, you're going to be told whether it was a nolo, whether it was a probation, and then what it was. But you're not going to know, and when it was generally. But you need to get with the individual, and that's why I recommend using these FCRA procedures to say, hey, we found some information. Here's what we found, and based on this, we're thinking about discluding you. This is your opportunity to give us some information. Then that's when you're going to find out, well, what happened? And, tell me what was going on. Oh, this was a domestic, dispute. And yes, I did get arrested for assault because I had to, punch my husband who was attacking me, and I can get you the documentation from my lawyer to show you that. Or other than that one time, I had a great history. I never had any issues. And since then, I have worked for the following organizations. I have done the following good deeds. I can get you letters of recommendation, et cetera. So those are the types of things that you want to give the individual an opportunity to provide to you, and then consider it. And again, absent an absolute bar, such as sex offenders, right? I don't care what your reasoning is or how much rehabilitation you've had. We cannot be right with our vulnerable population. But or if you are in the financial industry, there are certain convictions you can't have, and we're going to talk about loan origination here in a second. That would be another one. But absent those absolute bars, you want to engage in this dialogue, and that's why I think doing that FCRA type notice or something that is modified for this situation is a really good idea. And then that will also give you the documentation that you might need later to show, look, we did go through an analysis. We did give the person an opportunity to respond, and here's what they responded or they didn't. And so those are, and that, again, that's a very broad overview because we have limited time, but I think if you just follow those general pointers, it can be very helpful. Any questions on that? This is typically where I get folks that have a lot of questions.
Star 5 to unmute.
Natalie, I had a question. I just want to make sure I understood. You said in Texas there's 3 things that you consider like a conviction?
Well, in Texas,
and it's nolo contendere, deferred adjudication, and probation. Is that correct?
There are so many different. I gave 3 examples. It's not that there's only 3. Yeah, it's any disposition, in other words, that is not just an arrest. So you will see, depending on the state particularly. For example, you'll have somebody in Texas, but they might have had an issue that was in Florida. If the disposition, other than it being dropped, being dismissed by the prosecutor because they felt that it really wasn't a case, anything else that is essentially somebody pleading guilty to get probation or pleading no contest and taking consequences, how that's the verbiage that's used to describe that differs. But yes, in Texas, you can look at that as a conviction, quote, record. What you'll find is the individuals often will come back and say, well, my lawyer told me that it wouldn't be a conviction. My lawyer told me, well, I understand that's what your lawyer told you, but it still comes up on your background. And because you pled no contest or because you pled guilty, and yes, you might have successfully completed your probation, but nonetheless, it is on your criminal background check, and we can still take that into consideration and will. Now, the fact that they successfully completed probation might be something, one of those factors that you want to take into consideration when you're analyzing whether that record is a bar to participation in the activity at issue, whether it's employment, volunteer, whatever. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Great.
Another question. Can you hear me?
I can.
We passed a eligibility rule several years ago about not accepting anyone with a felony within the past 7 years. Are we on safe ground with that?
No, you're not. You mean for employment or for?
No,
well,
for
let me ask what it's for.
It is for participation as a homeowner, potential homeowner in the program.
No, you need to be, you don't want to have black line rules like that. You want to be, now, certain types of felonies, yes, but there are so many, a felony is so broad encompassing, and it also varies by state, by state, by state. So I would recommend that, no, you don't just have a bright line rule. But now, I will tell you, generally speaking, if somebody's had a felony in the last 7 years, they probably are going to be excluded, but not necessarily. And this is something you developed at the affiliate level?
Yes, with attorneys.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, again, I'd have to see, and you might want to talk with your attorney on the, kind of get a feel for why they did that for the home, for the participation as a family partner for the home ownership. But there is, as a matter of fact, there's right now some cases that are being decided on that issue in the fair housing aspect of whether policies like that have this disparate impact, this unintentional discriminatory impact. And so you want to, because of all that happening.
Yeah. We're working with minorities and low income. Everyone's on the same foot there. So dispirited. I'm kind of, I think it would hold,
It could, yeah. And again, so if it would hold because of that reason, see, not all the Habitat affiliates could say that they're working with a minority, a full minority population. So, for example, here in Comau, we do. I would say we have a large instance, but not all. We also have a lot of low income that are not minority that we're dealing with. So that might be why your lawyers feel comfortable with the bar, because not concerned about the impact it would have, because all of your applicants, like you said, are on the same footing. So that's why, again, these are kind of general principles. So if that's true, if, look, we don't get applicants from the non-minorities, and or we can show that almost all of our homes are granted to the minorities, or we're not, in other words, we're not denying minorities with felonies while we have non-minorities who are getting to participate.
So that would be our saving grace until we get it redone.
It would, absolutely. Yeah, because it actually has to have that negative impact on the minority population. So, but as a general, these bright line rules can lead to arguments that it has that negative impact. But it sounds like, that might be very well why your lawyer said, look, we're not worried about that, because looking at it historically, we only deal with minorities. Now, that's not going to be the same in the employment context, most likely, right? Or the volunteer context, for example, although volunteers have a right to bring a discrimination claim. But in the employment context, that's probably going to be different. So you certainly would not want to have that in the employment context.
In fact, probably half our staff has had felonies. So, no problem there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. No, very good question. I think that's a very good point that to make, so that all of you are putting all this in the context of how each of your affiliate runs and what population you're serving. So excellent question.
Natalie, there's a question, this is Amy, that came over through chat, and it says, is it possible to consolidate the language in the form to allow the employer to run any series checks? So I guess sex offender, criminal, driver, credit, all on one form for volunteers and employees and et cetera.
Yeah, you can, essentially. I mean, what you want to do is you want to have, if you're going to do all these types of checks, then the notice, and I have to pull what the language is on one of our sample notices, but essentially what you're telling the person, it's actually called a consumer report or a background check. So if you're using that in broad terms, and you can say which may include, information regarding your criminal background, and I consider sex registry to be criminal background, by the way, so I don't think you have to separate that, your driving record, et cetera. I don't have a problem with that. What you don't want to do is lump completely unrelated things. And in fact, I'm going to see if I can find some language while we're talking that we use that I might be able to give you for that. But the short answer is I don't have a problem so long as it's within reason. Because the FCRA notice really is about providing the person the knowledge that you're running a check, you're using a credit reporting agency to do so. And part of that might depend, I'm kind of backing up a little bit, some of that will depend on what is your agency providing you, meaning, for example, I have one of my clients, they have to do driving records as well. Their agency, the report that they get from that agency has their driving record and their criminal, right, and then the sex registry, and it's all in one report. And so obviously that one FCRA notice is appropriate for that situation. But if you're doing things all willy-nilly, meaning that's not in a negative way, but meaning we're going on DPS records and we're looking at driving records ourselves and we're checking the registry ourselves, but then we're having another agency run the criminal background check, then I would separate them out because you have different parties that are running those checks. And you have, when you notify the individual, hey, we're thinking of making an adverse decision based on what we found, they need to know, okay, who am I going to be contacting with questions about this or to provide information, which is the second part of this, but yet it should all flow together. Did that answer the question? It was kind of an answer, I know, but.
And remember, *5 to mute and unmute.
It's okay. Yeah, okay, well, if you get another chat question, and like I said, I'm going to try to pull up, I'm got another computer here. So while we're talking, I'm going to look at some language, and if I can give you some good language to use for that situation, I will do that as we're moving forward. So we'll move forward, and then I'll try to pull it up. Okay, so good questions, very good questions. All right, so I will move on then. Let's talk briefly about OFAC and the SDNs. I really think that, again, the International has provided really good information on this. But essentially, you can't engage in a financial transaction with anybody who supports terrorism, or narcotics traffickers, et cetera. There is a list of those folks that you cannot have these transactions with. Well, what are financial transactions? Well, mortgages and home sales. Obviously, that's going to apply to your family partners. You're going to be needing to run this check to make sure that a person who is going to be obtaining the home or living in the home is not on this list of supporting terrorism. Your contractors and subcontractors, and then land purchases for those of you who actually, most of you, I'm assuming, purchase land, whether it's on a subdivision basis or if it's individual lots, and any other major purchases. Where the line is drawn, you have to kind of do a risk-benefit analysis here, meaning if I'm going to go and purchase a very small item, I'm going to enter into a minor transaction, then it's very unlikely you need to go run and do an OFAC check. But if I'm buying, $100,000 worth of materials or $50,000 worth of materials from somebody for the construction of a home, then the safest course of action is going to be to run that check. You want to run your checks initially and then periodically. So, for example, for family selection, you're going to do it before you select the family. You're going to do it at the selection, and you want to do it quarterly thereafter. For any contracts that you have with contractors, subcontractors, ongoing transactions, same thing. So if you've got
Natalie?
an existing relationship, yes.
Say that again about the quarterly and the homeowners, family selection.
So for homeowners, yeah, so pre-selection, right, before you select the family, at the time that selection is made,
okay.
Probably at closing, I would say, and then you want to be checking quarterly thereafter if we are remaining, and I should qualify that, if you are remaining in a transaction with them, meaning you are carrying the mortgage. And so I don't know what the various affiliates do that are on the phone, whether you, like for example, in Comal County, we retain our mortgages. We have not sold those to another company. And so because of that, you want to be periodically, if you're in that situation, making sure that this individual and the individuals that live in the home with that individual are not on this list because you have an ongoing transaction with them. They're paying their mortgage payments, right?
So we have a right to ask a single person who else is living there, but family?
Yes. I mean, you generally do. At least I know we generally here know who is living in the home. For example, also just ensuring that we do that, at least in Comal County, for example, to also, unrelated to this issue, to ensure that we don't have somebody who's inhabiting the home but then basically renting it out to other individuals, et cetera. Now, that doesn't mean you need to know who's visiting with them for the weekend, but if you actually have folks that are living in the home and you're aware of it on a continuous and regular basis, then yes, you want to be running this check.
And so we go up and say, thank you very much, we know, and this is why we need to know, and we need to check him out, right, or her out.
Yeah, I mean, usually the pre-selection information, you're going to have that information, I'm assuming, because in the pre-selection phase, you're being given all the information about their family and who the members of their family are. And usually what this is really going to come down to is the husband, the wife, and or if it's a non-married individual who has, say, a boyfriend or a consistent boyfriend. You're generally going to know that. Now, if you have a large affiliate where you've got a large number of these mortgages, I am not necessarily suggesting that you have to go out every quarterly and do a door check and say, hey, who all's living here? But do it based upon the information that you reasonably have available to you, and that's going to depend upon what information you've already been given through the selection process and information that you just know because of your ongoing relationship with your homeowners, with your family members.
And so when I call them and say I'm going to update your information and blah, 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 and da-da-da, and I can ask about who else is living there. Got it.
Yeah, you can. Absolutely.
Natalie?
And now for the OFAC check, you're just going online and you're running a check. This,
right.
You don't need to be sending out this notice and getting the consent and all this. This is just going on the website and double checking to make sure we don't have a terrorist, which is so incredibly unlikely to occur, but there you have it. Go ahead, I heard another question.
Natalie, this is Michelle in Fort Worth with Trinity Habitat. We would be one of those affiliates who have a large number. We have right about 500 families. What is the industry standard for this check outside of Habitat? Do they do it? Did the regular mortgage companies check?
That's a very good question, and I did not ask the mortgage lender because typically that's something that you would kick off to the mortgage lender and then they just take care of it. I can find out from some local area mortgage lenders how they're handling this. It's so new. It's so pretty much
right, because we did check.
Darn new. I don't know that there's really been an industry quote standard that's been developed. I mean, I know International recommends that you try to do it quarterly and or you kick it off to your mortgage lender. Now, do you hold your own mortgages or do you?
We hold our own mortgages, but we have someone who services them for us.
Okay, then you're.
we do.
Whoever's servicing. Okay, go ahead.
I was going to say we do the initial when they're approved, and because it is 6 to 9 months prior to the start of the house and then the closing, we do it then. But after the closing, we haven't established a process where we do it quarterly. Because that was what we were.
Closing, you have another, but after the closing, it sounds like that you do have a partner that's managing basically.
That is servicing them.
Yeah, we
also only do the borrowers. We do the borrowers and representatives that they document that are living in the house. As you were saying, that's all that we do.
And I think that's fine. That's why I'm saying, I don't feel this need to go out and knock on doors and say, is anybody new living here or et cetera. It's just who you have.
So you're saying that you think that the people servicing our mortgage would be handling this quarterly report?
I would ask. I think you want to get it out on the table with them and make sure they are, and ask them if they are. And if there's a difference of opinion on that, then you guys need to resolve it. And
because right now that seems a bit onerous for 500 families.
You would,
That seems
well,
a bit much.
it does for you. That's why I would think whoever is servicing these would have some sort of an automated process that's a lot simpler. You know, here, for example, in Comal, where we don't have a large number of homes, it's not going to be that big a deal. It's a couple seconds to go online, put their name in, see if they pop up as a match on the OFAC list. For you, yes, a large number like that, I would very much expect whoever's servicing the mortgages to be doing that, and for them to have an automated process for how they do that.
Yeah, I got the website.
What kind of information
Okay, we'll check that out. Thank you.
do you need to run the OFAC check? Do you need Social Security number?
The OFAC check is, and actually, and I don't know if I said this at the beginning too, but there is, the affiliate has actually, because I didn't want to put a whole bunch of information on these slides, just so you know, the affiliate has put out some information on step-by-step how to do it. There's also an OFAC policy and procedural manual that the Office of Foreign Asset Control puts out, and that's at www.treas.gov /OFAC. I should have put that on here. So that's www.treas.gov /OFAC. And so I recommend you look at that when it comes to questions on technicalities of how you do it, because I was getting ready to talk about matches, but how you identify whether somebody is a match and what is a match is really nicely set out in their guidelines, what steps you take, and at what point you now need to be calling OFAC and reporting that you have a match. So questions like that I would put in, or I would refer or defer to the guidelines. But it is, my understanding is no, it is their name, that it's just a name match. And so you're not putting in their Social Security number, et cetera. And that's why, again, they give you very, very detailed information on how you run the check and how you verify that a match occurs and what steps that you go through to do that, to make sure that you're not getting a mishit, in other words. And you know, it's just, I understand why, I guess it's important to do this, et cetera, but it seems a bit much for Habitat to be worrying about this little thing, but it's one of these things that you got to do. So, but for those technical questions, rather than spend a bunch of time here, since I know we have limited time, I would go to that, and then Habitat has also put out some kind of technical procedural guidelines on that as well.
Okay, combine those on my Habitat.
Okay.
I have a question when the appropriate time. I have a question regarding sex offender registry. Is this a good time, or would you want me to go back to that?
Sure, that's fine before we move on to the next slide. Go ahead.
Well, no, go ahead and finish your presentation and let me ask, because it's a specific question.
Okay. We're almost there, so that's fine. I just don't want you to forget it, so make sure you put out a note. Okay. And then the SAFE Act, the affiliate has also given you guys some information on that. I won't go into it very deeply, but for loan origination employees, a loan originator cannot have a certain criminal background. They can't have there's your felony in the past 7 years, and they can never have been convicted of a crime of fraud, dishonesty, a breach of trust, or money laundering. Now, in Texas, if it is a true loan originator, they're most likely going to be licensed. And the state of Texas, for the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation, they are going to have run this check to do so. This is kind of still shaking itself out. I know that International has directed that the affiliates do run a check for any loan origination employees to make sure that they haven't been convicted in the last 7 years or ever convicted. Now, again, it's interesting because you have your Texas, you're not supposed to go back more than 7 years, but yet you have this saying if they've ever been convicted. Well, here would be an example where if you're using a third party and they provide you more information than 7 years, you can use it because the statute specifically allows you to go back as far as the criminal history goes. But I think this has to shake itself out a little bit, quite honestly. I mean, a loan originator is very broadly defined. It's anybody who takes an application or offers or arranges or assists with applying to obtain consumer credit, which is a mortgage, that's going to apply, obviously, or represents that he or she is going to do so. So typically the folks that you think about on this are your mortgage lenders, your bankers. So my banking clients, for example, yes, they're loan originators. They are clearly identified as a loan originator, and they are required to demonstrate that they meet these requirements. For Habitat, arguably you have a lot of folks who take applications and help to obtain credit or the mortgage. And where that line is drawn is really unclear to me. And it doesn't come into effect until January of next year. So I'm hoping that there's going to be some more guidelines on that, particularly as it relates to folks that are in your shoes, because it doesn't quite make sense. It's not completely clear. I would say for now, if you're running your criminal background check and you have somebody who's going to be involved in that mortgaging process with that aspect of the family partnership, you want to be looking, obviously, to make sure they don't have a felony in the past 7 years and they've never been convicted of crimes of fraud, dishonesty, breach of trust, money laundering. This is one of the reasons why, while the affiliates are not required to run criminal background checks of all employees, this is why I nonetheless recommend you do, because then if we have somebody who is arguably a loan originator, we will be able to at least show, well, look, we did run a check. And then if we do find this information, there is a felony in the last 7 years, and this person is involved in the loan origination process, we can now perhaps be taking that into play on those non-discriminatory factors that we talked about earlier, the facts and circumstances that we need to analyze to determine whether somebody can or cannot be employed. And it's during that analysis that you're going to have to determine, okay, is this person really a, quote, loan originator, or can we insulate this person from that aspect of the Habitat process and still enable them to perform their job? It'll just depend. So it's a little early to kind of see how this all shakes out, but you want to start doing these checks. And for anybody who has been employed with you already that is doing this, if you were never running any sort of criminal background check before, then you're going to want to run a criminal background check for those folks, certainly. And the FCRA does allow you to run criminal background checks with somebody who is already an employee, so long as you have a legitimate purpose to do so, like promoting to a new position, or here you've got a new requirement under the law. So if you haven't been doing them in the past and you have somebody that you feel is really a loan originator or deeply involved in this loan origination process, I would recommend that you do the criminal background check, and obviously for any new hires you want to be doing it. I think you should be doing it in general, but certainly for these types of folks.
Is a loan originator considered family selection committee members who looks at those credit reports?
I do not. I would say no. Again, this hasn't completely shaken out yet, but I would say no. This is not somebody who is. This is somebody who's just looking at it, but they're not actually. Meaning, they're, well, I guess it depends on what your family selection person is doing. I mean, are they just looking at it because they're on the committee and they get to see this information, or are they making the decision and are they helping them get through the process of
they're making the
qualifying
decision whether they
loan?
get a house or not?
Ours do. Ours help them through that process.
Well, they're making the decision whether they get a home, but are they involved in the processing of the documentation, of getting them qualified for, the actual financing part of it? When you say they're determining whether they get a home, for example, are they somebody who comes in and says, we've kind of looked at the stuff they've provided, we've looked at their credit history, and we don't think that this is somebody that is going to, that we would put towards, for example, take to your board to recommend for family selection? Are you talking about that individual, or are you talking about the individuals who are now?
Right now, the family selection committee looks at the applications, looks at the credit reports. Based on that information, then they say yes or no on whether we accept them into the process.
Since they're taking the application,
the office, the application.
I would run it. Mm-hmm.
Okay, but they look at the application and they take that information and make a decision.
And I'm assuming they work with the family as well, for example, on, we can get this cleared off of our credit. This is what happened. Okay, let's get that cleared. And they're working with the families to work through those types of issues, for example, I'm assuming. Is that true?
At that point, they say no, you're not in the program, and to be blunt, we turn them loose. and we don't
right.
go up to work them through the process.
Okay. Well, I would take the safer course of action and make sure that you're running the check.
Okay.
Again, a general background check will find this type of information. And your family selection committee members, are they volunteers or employees?
Volunteers?
Okay. Well, if they're volunteers, then no. If they're employees, yes.
Okay.
This does not apply to volunteers.
Okay.
Yeah. So sorry. Yeah, I should have asked the first part of your question. But yeah, no. I'm talking about the employees that are involved with the family selection. Okay. Yeah. No, just a committee member who's volunteering. Don't worry about that.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. All right. And then real briefly on other credit checks. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Natalie. One more question. Who should we run checks on? Family Services Director, who receives applications, grants, admin, completes loan documents with families, bookkeeper, finance director.
You know, I don't know that the finance director, again, it's really about the people who are taking the application, they're arranging, they're assisting with that mortgage process. I mean, kind of think about it as a mortgage process. If it's just, now, I would be running this check for anybody who is in a CFO type capacity, who's working with our finance anyway. So I'm recommending you would do that anyway. But whether they fall within this loan origination, it's really going to be, it's very fact specific. The safest course of action, run the check. If you're questioning in your mind, is this person potentially a loan originator, I would run it. And then if there are, I truly would like to see as this develops that folks like you do not have to worry about these types of things. I don't think that's going to occur, however. I think you're going to have to continue to deal with this. This is one of those situations, in my opinion, where the law was meant to deal with the mortgage lending crisis and banks and mortgage lenders and banks, because this is all the Frank Dodd Act where this came out of. But now it's the way it is written, and Habitat does not have any sort of exclusion. I think you want to take the safest course of action. If you have any doubt, run the check. Okay, good. Okay, well, very briefly, I just wanted to mention credit checks in general, especially for employees. If you are running a check, I recommend, unless it's a financial position, that you not run credit checks. The Bankruptcy Code does prohibit discrimination against individuals because they've had a bankruptcy. Obviously, because of discrimination laws, your decisions have to be related to your business or your organization and your mission, what you're doing. And so I very much question, absent a financial position, what relevance a credit check would have. It used to be in the old days, folks would say if you've got bad credit, that must mean you are not a person of good moral character, and that's just not the case. Certainly, at least that's not the prevailing view anymore. So we recommend that you do not do that. The other problem, of course, is credit checks. You find out information kind of like Googling somebody. Sometimes you find information you wish you didn't have, like, oh, the reason they have bad credit is because they got in trouble with all their extremely high medical bills, and now we know somebody has a medical condition, and if they're an employee, we have to be careful not to discriminate because of a disability. So I think credit checks are dangerous, except as required. Obviously, you have to do your credit checks for your families, right, for the lending process. To the extent you want to consider the SAFE Act to be related to credit, it really isn't, but to the extent it is, obviously you have to be doing credit checks or you have to be doing them, but you don't want to just do them for a general purpose like for and mainly employees is what I'm talking about, because it's dangerous. Okay, so best practices, and then we can follow up with any questions. Make sure you're doing the background checks. Get a third party, really, if you can't afford it at all. Do have a policy on when do we do it, why do we do it, how do we do it, how do we analyze it, certainly for sex registry, but also for criminal background. Again, the affiliates have been provided or can obtain through international some really good policies and forms. Run some checklists and guidelines to make sure you are doing these things timely. For the folks that are worried about OFAC, and if you're doing it yourself, have some checklists, some sort of reminder system that you're doing that. Checklists to help you analyze. I talked earlier again about a matrix of these are the absolute no crime, and these are the ones we may or may not, and these are the ones that are a go. If you can develop something like that, great. But yeah, no bright lines in general. And then follow those procedures we talked about for notifying and working with the individual to review any information obtained. And then finally, of course, make sure you're retaining things. We're not going to get into all the different retention requirements, but for employment records, you need to retain things for certain times, obviously for your mortgage-related documents, et cetera. And if there's any issue of compliance, you want to make sure that you're documenting your compliance. I think these form letters will help you do that in general, but to the extent that you need to otherwise document, especially if something gets kind of squirrely, make sure you're documenting how you dealt with something. So I think I've covered all these in the general, but I just kind of wanted to summarize that quickly because I know we're running out of time, so or may have even run out of time. I can't see my clock on my computer with the slides. So, all right. Any questions? I know we had one back on the sex registry, so let's start there, and then any other questions?
I have a situation I've recently become aware of where we have a homeowner single parent, who has been in her home about 6 or 7 years, and about 3 years ago, she notified us that she had married, and I'm still not sure if that's common law marriage or a legal marriage, but anyway, the gentleman lives in her home, and I was notified by a couple of other homeowners that he has a reputation in the community as a sex offender. So I went on the Texas website, and sure enough, there was his picture, plain as day. And I am trying to figure out if we have, now obviously this could potentially be a giant PR problem, but beyond that, I'm trying to figure out if we have any legal grounds of action in that situation. We did not initially run a background check on him because he was not even in the picture when the homeowner.
Yeah, and he's not the responsible party on
Correct.
Your documentation. He's not.
Correct.
I'm assuming he's not participating, and I mean, in terms of is he actively involved with volunteering or otherwise involved with? Okay.
No involvement at all. I am concerned on a different level because the homeowner has 2 children. So it disturbs me in that way, but that's not, he's...
Well, yeah, and so, there's really not a whole lot I don't think that you can do here. I mean, if this person is otherwise complying with, in other words, this isn't an applicant for family selection. This is somebody who's, you can't really go and evict somebody, for example, out of the home. The PR issue is a big one. This is something I think your board probably wants to sit down and examine. Now, when you did the registry, I know they're registered, but sometimes they will tell you, for example, that the individual is not allowed to be within so many feet of any child, not just where they congregate, but that's the statute. But a lot of times the penalty for a sex offender is more restrictive than the statute. So if you have that information and he's in violation of it, which relates to your question about the kids, you can certainly report that violation. And let the system work through that. So again, I don't know how much information you obtained sometimes they give you that, sometimes they don't. Generally, a lot of times they will, meaning if the person is not supposed to be within 20 feet of a kid, they will put that on the registry information so that neighbors, et cetera, know that. So you might want to look and see if there's anything like that was there, so you can kind of take action by reporting it. But as far as, how do we want to deal with this from PR issue and in general, how do we want to do this going forward? That's something I would get together with your board on and make a decision on how you think you should best do that. And again, it might be, I don't know what this, again, you might even want to sit down and talk with this individual homeowner and or this individual who's the registered offender to find out what were the circumstances. Why is he on this list? and you might get a comfort level from that. I will tell you, for example, I've had folks that have been put on these lists because they were convicted of statutory rape because they were 20 years old and they had sex with their girlfriend in college who happened to be underage, and dad got mad. So, you know, while technically a sex offender who has to register, the facts and circumstances are mitigating, whether you agree with them or not, they're at least mitigating in terms of danger, immediate danger to other children. So I think you might want to find out a little bit more information and then decide how you want to proceed on that. Okay.
Thank you.
Other questions?
I have one. This is Linda in Midland. If we deny someone on credit because we have a minimum credit rating, do you share with them a copy of the credit report from the third party?
Yeah.
You would do that. At one time, I thought we couldn't. You know, so the answer is we should or we can.
You can, yes, and you should. That is, again, let me ask this, how are you obtaining I'm assuming you're using a third party to run the credit check?
Correct.
Yeah, you need to, when you provide them the written notice of their potential ineligibility, you want to give them a copy of the background check or the credit report and in that summary of their rights. Because and the reason you have to do that under the law is sometimes there's mistakes that are made, and the individual needs to be provided the credit report and what their rights are, so that they can contact the reporting agency and address any inaccuracies, et cetera. So yes, you should provide the report to the individual.
Along with a copy of their rights. Is that what I got? I came in on late.
No, that's okay. So you want to provide them a notice that, look, you're going to be potentially ineligible because of your credit report. Here's a copy of your credit report. Here's a summary of your rights, which are available on the FTC's website. You have 5 days to let us know. If you think this is wrong, to provide us a corrected one, get back to us, et cetera. And if you don't, then you're going to be ineligible.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Right. You bet. Anything else? Okay. Well, thank you,
Natalie.
That
was really excellent. I appreciate you being here.
You bet. And again, I just apologize to everybody if you had registered for the first one and had to re-register that we had to reschedule. So I hope I didn't overly inconvenience anybody. And I will, and on the follow-up, I know for the one question about the mortgage companies, kind of how they're dealing with OFAC, I will send an email out to some of my mortgage lending clients and just see if I get anything back on that. And if I do, Amy, I will send that for you to share with the group.
Absolutely, and I'll send out a recording. If you registered, I'll send out the recording or a link to where you can watch it online. So if you have any questions or need to share or follow up, you'll have that information. It usually takes about a day.
And Natalie?
Yes.
I have just a question about mortgages in general. If you've got time, or can answer.
Yeah, I may or may not be able to answer it since
that's
mortgages are done. Yeah.
So, but when everything else is ready, I got that one question to ask.
Okay. I just want to ask, Amy, are you going to make that presentation available to all of us?
Yes. This presentation will be emailed to you.
Okay, excellent, because I have a few people who I know are going to want to review it.
Yes.
I'm going to want to review it.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, it will take about a day, so.
No problem.
Thank you, Amy, for putting this on, and thank you for doing the presentation. That was very helpful.
You bet.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I would say on the mortgage question, if you want to ask it, whoever asked that, I can field it, but I will tell you I'm probably not the best person to be asking the question.
I was told by Habitat that we have about 8 or 9 mortgages that come due throughout different days of the month, different times of the month. And I was told by Habitat that I could send those folks a letter that says, we're moving your mortgage to the first of the month, and we're changing your grace period from, I got one that's got a 29-day grace period, to 10 days. And Habitat told me I could do it. Now my attorney that is working with Habitat says, no, you can't do that.
Mm-hmm.
So
I would go with your attorney because I think some of that's going to be very specific towards your document.
The document states that you're due on the 12th and you got 29 days to pay. I mean,
so that's going to be a contractual issue. So I'm probably depending on the circumstances, I would follow your attorney because Habitat, the international, or they're giving general principles, but for anything that's just like this presentation, general purposes, anything that's very specific, you want to be talking to your counsel and following whatever direction you're getting there because they're going to have the full picture that Habitat, the big Habitat, is not going to have.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
It was a very good presentation and very scary.
No, hopefully not too scary. All right. Thank you, everybody.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Amy, I'll
Bye-bye.
Tomorrow.
Oh, yeah.
Anything else?
Do what?
I said I'll see you tomorrow. Anything else we need to do?
No, ma'am. I appreciate it. I'm looking forward to being in West Texas.